Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
One of the things that I get out of these humanistic psychologists is their sense that healthy people are able to sort of trust their own impulses.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Sister Carmen Gillick, a pastoral minister at St. Mary's Student Parish in Ann Arbor, Michigan. The topic of this week's Reflections is Christian maturity, trusting our experience. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Well, Carmen, I'm glad that you have found time from your immensely busy schedule to be here with me and to talk a little bit. I want to talk about the relationship between religion and psychology. Now, I know you've studied religion to some degree. It seems to me that I encountered you at Notre Dame on one occasion when you were working on some project. What was that, by the way?
I was taking comprehensive exams in systematic theology.
That is impressive indeed.
And my first background is psychology.
Oh, it is? Oh, you do know something about this topic. That's good. I'm glad to hear that. But anyway, you were doing that systematic, and I remember you were interested in the theology of Karl Rahner at that time, which happens to be one of my own interests.
Yes, and what I found fascinating is how what Rahner is saying on theological points is similar but in a different language to what psychologists are saying on growth issues. And in many ways, they're both talking about the same human reality.
Well, that sets a good frame for looking at this question of religion and psychology. I suppose one of the perceptions has been that those two things are opposed, that a lot of modern psychology has been premised on the idea that religion really is an obstacle to human growth. If you go back to the founder of what we think of as modern psychology, Sigmund Freud wrote a famous book called The Future of an Illusion, in which his perception was that religion kept people in an infantile state, that it kept them from becoming mature because it was simply a projection. So he thought that human beings needed a father figure, and so out of that psychic need they projected the existence of one. And as long as they were beholden to that God, then they never got around to really shaping their own lives or taking hold of things. So for him, religion was a projection that kept human beings in an infantile state. So we start out with, in modern psychology, with sort of a sense that the two things are antithetical, that they don't work together, that Christian maturity almost is a contradiction in terms. So we have to begin to deal with that, I think.
Well, I think one of his followers who broke with him, Carl Jung, took him up on that point and said, no, the true religious dimension is the key to human freedom. And he saw that some of the religiosity maybe that Freud was pointing to could lead to the negative results that Freud pointed to. But what he said was that Freud was not in touch with the deeper dimension, the transcendent dimension. And that's where Jung's own research and experience and interaction with people led him to look at what used the word individuation as one of his key concepts on the road to maturity.
Seems to me, I recall Carl Jung saying something that after you were 35 or something, that the great questions of life really were questions of meaning. We know that for Freud, the sexual dimension of life was the key, the instinctual life, and it was sort of as though we had this boiling cauldron inside of ourselves, and that we needed some way to deal with that. I think he saw religion largely as functioning as a repression along that line. And I think what Jung is very much in, I guess, with many Christian spiritual writers these days, and because he did open up that other dimension, he becomes one of those kindred spirits for believers. And I think that we could look at the whole movement of psychology in the 20th century since the time of Freud as being ways of trying to open up a certain narrow focus that I think Freud left us. We see a lot of the psychologists interested in other aspects of experience than Freud studied. For example, Abraham Maslow liked to examine healthy people rather than neurotic people. So he begins to see something different. We see Jung brings in the question of meaning as crucial, which obviously raises religious issues.
But I guess one of the things that I see is, like, even if you take the sexual issues that Freud was so homing in on, Jung picked them up in a different way and said, yes, in one way that can be a boiling cauldron, but if we look at the masculine and feminine dimension within ourselves and have that come to a unity or a dialogue within the individual, then the sexual issue is not projected onto an exterior world, but it's resolved within. Then meaning begins to be formulated in some respects and includes the sexual dimension. That seems to be the emphasis of the more modern approach to the psychological, and then ties in so well with the spiritual, and in some ways with what contemporary scientific findings are coming up with of a holistic approach.
Well, I think you certainly have isolated there one strain in the modern psychological literature. I think we often associate that with the third force of the humanistic psychologists. A lot of people know Abraham Maslow or Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, or Carl Rogers' work on becoming a person and things like that. And those people, I think, are great dialogue partners. I think if we're going to fill out the picture, we got to remember that some of the post-Freudians have also been sort of down on religion. You could point to B.F. Skinner as an example of that. B.F. Skinner wrote that book Beyond Freedom and Dignity, where he really challenged the very notion of freedom. Now, it's awfully hard to talk about God and our relationship with God and the meaning of religion if freedom is nothing but an illusion itself. And even in Skinner's notion, a dangerous illusion, I must say, because he felt that if you keep thinking of yourself as free, then you're not going to get around to programming the environment the way you ought to, so that we can get human behavior to work as we want it to. So we have to, I think, if we're looking at this whole spectrum of modern psychology in relationship to religion, we find that there's still strains in it, the behaviorist strain here, which is not totally open to the religious dimension, I would say.
But that seems to fit with what one might even describe as a maturity pattern in relationship to the individual person. Seems like the behaviorists have taken certain concepts and absolutized them, as opposed to dealing with them in the norm. Even when you deal with experimental data in terms of psychology, there's usually a part of it in the center which deals with the norm, and then once you get out to the edges and on either side, then your data is very skewed. That seems to be also true in dealing with some of these other concepts like freedom, sexuality, individuation, unity, any one of those concepts.
What did you mean exactly when you said that outside these limits it's skewed? What's an example of that?
Okay, if you take, let's say, if you take your finger, the finger jerk, when a very little electricity, let's say, is used, there's no response whatsoever. If you put too much of a jolt in, then again you don't get a response. The hand is paralyzed, and you could carry that into much greater examples, but it's in the norm or in the middle range where you can see differences and the human person response.
Mm-hmm. Well, I suppose that would fit into something I was saying before, I suppose, about Maslow. When you're going to study psychology, you might do well to look at healthy people as well as people who are suffering from mental illnesses and get more into the range of normal, average behavior. And I suppose that when you do that, one of the things that I get out of these humanistic psychologists is their sense that healthy people are able to sort of trust their own impulses, that they work out of an inner light in a way. I think it was David Reisman who distinguished people in terms of inner directed or outer directed. And I think what the psychologists would say is that the inner directed people are healthier and move closer to full human functioning. And the picture I get is of the outer directed people is that their antennae are out all the time. They're always trying to
figure out what do other people want them to say, or how do other people want them to act, or what does the peer group say you ought to do, or what does the culture indicate is the proper behavior. Those outer-directed people seem to have less of this mark of maturity, where the inner-directed sort of work out of conviction. They are able to perceive their world. They have certain principles they're guided by, and they're able to go against peer pressure, for example. They're able to be countercultural people because there is some sort of deeper conviction inside of themselves that they're operating out of. Now, that we might work with that idea there for a while and see where that takes us.
I think it's an important concept of inner and outer directed. But my experience, both in dealing with lots of people as they come to talk, and also in some of the popularized literature on some of the great psychologists, is that when it gets to that level, those concepts aren't nuanced well enough. For example, yes, to grow to inner directedness as opposed to being like a ball bounced on the sand by everything that's coming along, definitely is a mark of maturity. But when that's said popularly, it doesn't seem to take into consideration sufficiently enough the fact that when one is inner-directed, knows who they are from inside out, as opposed to being sort of a reflection of every mirror they pass, they're able then to interact more deeply and respond more really to the outer world, and to see that outer world a lot more as it really is. So, as one becomes more inner-directed, one simultaneously becomes more outer-engaged in a proper way. Dealing with a college student just yesterday on some of these related topics, the individual was working at the inner part, but in some ways losing contact with a lot of just very concrete outer realities that you have to deal with when you live in the 21st century. So probably the thing that in growing to this kind of maturity, I see many of these people having wonderful insights that can be used in a comprehensive whole. But when they're used in a almost a catchword manner, then I can see them almost being antithetical to growth and maturity.
So your point is that the inner-directed person is in touch with reality and is able to take reality on its own terms, drink it in, is aware of what's going on. I think you probably would see a twofold movement there. First of all, I would think that the growth to maturity results in part precisely because people are open to reality. I mean, if you take it at the extreme again of the autistic person, I mean, evidently what happens is they're simply overwhelmed by reality, and therefore they have to screen it out, and they can't live in that kind of real world, where healthy, mature people have allowed the world, and with its all of its joys and sorrows and all of its ambivalence and ambiguity to impact them. They probably are the people who, as they've gone along, have not screened out the painful side of life, for example. They've been open to the tragic dimension. They've drunk in the joys of life and so on. And I would say this is what helps to form them in that way. I almost see that as habitual. I find that a lot of people who are struggling for maturity and not doing very well along that line are people who somewhere along the line, probably early in life, got into patterns of screening out reality. They simply weren't open to that side of it. I mean, it could be with any dimension of life. I mean, it could be the fact that you have to work hard in life, and that simply has been an unacceptable notion, and therefore at every turn they're trying to get out of things or not apply themselves and so on, so they get into a habit of always trying to get around the demands of life, and then they can't function effectively. So I think that I want to get to the second part of that, but I'm saying that part of the operation of growing in maturity, I think, is to let reality make its impact upon us and to be able to drink it in its ambiguity.
That, I think, raises a point that I end up dealing with a lot with people. And I think the adult children of alcoholics literature points the dynamic out quite well. That depending on which sources you read, the statistics are as high as 96% of people come from dysfunctional homes. I again, it depends on the source that you read.
I say I must begin to wonder about literature like that is so broad-based that everyone fits it. And I know that happens. I mean, if anybody reads those books, they always end up saying, "Oh, that's me." So I'm not sure what that tells us.
But the
go
reality
ahead with
that
your
there
point
are
anyway.
that there are certainly a significant number of people that come from homes that are not growth producing, and I've looked at the idea, what is it that seems to be the catch point for people who maybe come from tragic situations or difficult situations? And the catch point that keeps them from being open to reality, as you talked about so well, seems to be that, one, if their home was truly dysfunctional in a more clinical sense of the word, what is true and what is false gets so totally mixed. Because the individual, if, let's say, a parent is angry or a parent is drunk, the young person comes in and says, "What in the heck is Dad doing?" or Mom doing? And the other parent says, "Oh, nothing, they're fine." So they don't know how to label reality, so they keep it at bay. The second thing that I find is the stumbling block to growth is that somehow a person yearns for a whole and holistic family, and they think they can never go on with life until that has happened. But the reality is even those who come from good homes have other mentors and other guides who help them to learn to properly take care of themselves in order that they can love themselves and in turn love others. So if parents do not do a wonderful job or the family circle does not do a good job of that, one simply has to find it elsewhere, and at a certain point in time must stop lamenting that it was not in that first setting and drop the irrational assumption that I cannot be a full human being unless that happened since the first moment of my existence. Dropping that irrational supposition seems to be one of the key factors to healing, and of course ties into many religious dimensions that are psychologically related.
Well, there's a lot in what you just said. The first point that I get out of it is the notion that the family makes this impact, and that if it's not functioning well, then you don't get into this proper framework of labeling reality properly. I would say what I see in dealing with people like that is that they often get into one particular bad intellectual habit. That is, they end up blaming themselves for what goes wrong. In other words, if the father is drunk again and is abusive or something, then the youngster's sitting there saying, "What did I do wrong?" And it is almost a sense that if I did the right thing, then people indeed would be fine. You know, my parents would get along, they wouldn't get divorced if I functioned correctly. And there we get a very false perception of things. We get excessive guilt feelings going on. I suppose you could make a case that in some places religious instruction might end up in reinforcing that when it's not done in a healthy way. So that's one part of what I would pick up on what you had to say. You want to go back to that at all, or?
Just that, like in dealing, let's say, with college students and adults, I like to make a distinction for them between what is true religion and even the true tradition of various religions, as opposed to a poor explanation or explication of that, or even a dysfunctional explanation or explication, or the fact that we only hear often part of what is said. Because if that distinction isn't made, then the next step, because there's a tendency once one gets the monkey off one's own back, to try to move out and start blaming. So one could end up into a poor dynamic at that point in time to blame religion, whereas in many cases, no, that isn't the real issue. The real issue is that we're dealing with human reality, which in none of its expressions at any point in time is perfect.
I think what we'd like to say, too, is that in our Judeo-Christian tradition, it seems as though there are indeed resources which ought to help us to deal more effectively with this problem. So if we can delineate this problem, I think we're talking about maturity, and our claim, I think, is that there is a proper thing called Christian maturity. and that the two things can go together. And there's a lot of strains of thought in psychology that support that. In other words, you see psychologists saying things about the search for meaning that correspond with what the Christian message is all about. And what we would like to think, I think, is that there's in that Judeo-Christian tradition there are resources that would enable us to deal with some of these ways in which we're out of touch with reality. I think the first thing probably is that the tradition reminds us that there's a fundamental goodness about human nature, that God's Spirit resides in us, and that the impulses we have and the instinctual life that we know should not be seen simply as bad, as negative, as the boiling cauldron that will lead us in faulty directions. Now, it seems as though what the psychologists want us to do is to look more closely at some of that instinctual life and try to integrate it into a larger whole. And I think that fits in with the Christian notion that we are temples of the Spirit, that the Lord dwells within us, that God's creation has a fundamental goodness about it, and that we can indeed face up to the darker side of our own existence precisely because there's a God who's with us in the process. I think that goes too for as well as when we're looking at reality. The temptation we're talking about here, I think, is to screen out elements of reality that we can't face. And again, what the Christian message would tell us, I think, is that no, we can do that. Even the dark forces, the demonic forces, can be faced. It's one thing I would get out of the miracles of Jesus. Miracles of Jesus suggest that indeed there is a power greater than the demonic forces in the world. Jesus casts out the devils. He helps people to deal with their demons. And I think that our claim is that there's a power in the gospel and the Christian message that indeed would enable us to do that as well. So if you take it back to the concrete example that you brought up of the dysfunctional family, and if we say indeed we are dealing with an abusive father in this case, that the youngsters need to be taught that they have to name that correctly. So as you dealing with adults who are offspring of those kind of situations, then you have to try to get them in touch with reality and to say it's all right to face that. It's all right to say my father was abusive, my father was an alcoholic, and so on.
And I see that's where the Christian helper, in whatever capacity, be it psychotherapist, pastoral counselor, spiritual director, pastor, can function best when they have done that in their own lives and become in some ways an incarnation of that acceptance, and create, just by their very personhood, that kind of environment in which the other feels the acceptance of themselves. And when they feel that acceptance, even on the most simple of levels, then they're willing to risk speaking about the next level, which they have some insecurity about. And eventually will reach down to those levels where there is great insecurity and great doubt.
And that translates in concrete terms, doesn't it, about when you're dealing with people, I don't care if they're parents or friends or counselors or whatever, that we try to accept people as they are and affirm what is good and help people to deal with the reality of their lives. Maybe that's one of the best things that friends do, for example, for someone else, is to say, well, no, you're out of touch there. You know, you're not looking at that accurately. You're putting yourself down in a way that you don't need to. I notice that when people get together, and I suppose that's one of the values of these peer groups, and where people who have common problems that can talk, very often the response to the others is, my heavens, I'm not the only one, or I hated my mother and I thought that was terrible, but now I see that hating your mother is pretty natural in this situation, and therefore there's an affirmation about it, therefore one can begin to face that. And always, I think, with that view of saying more and more, the mature person is able to find that their instinctual life, their intuitive life is on target, that it works for them and not against them in trying to be fully functioning human beings.
And tying in with that, most of our Christian traditions celebrate baptism. And in many ways, that is a religious statement as to the root goodness of human persons. And when whatever is in the human has gone awry, that humanness is still blessed and is the ultimate revelation of who God is for us and who each of us is. And so we're seeing the dovetailing of the psychological and of the spiritual dimensions rather than the divorce of the two.
Yeah, you could do a whole analysis, I suppose, of the way the sacramental life of the Church attempts to promote maturity and helps us to integrate various aspects of our experience. Carmen, I want to get back to a point that you made before about part of the acceptance of reality, and part of that reality, I think, is that one will never live in a perfect world. I thought you made that point very well in dealing with people from dysfunctional families, although I think that goes across the board, that we have to get away from a certain utopianism. That's part of the unrealism of life. They're going to make it perfect, or it's all going to work like I want it to work, or the world's going to revolve around me, and so on, which isn't true. And I think part of the acceptance of reality is to admit that, to see it, and to begin to live that out. We can't create a utopian existence. There are no perfect families.
And I think that ties in a good deal to the dysfunctional situation, because for the person who comes, and the greater dysfunction, the more this seems to show up, that if there is some perfect world out there, I'm not in it, but it is. Whereas functional life is, we live well together, but not perfectly together.
Well said, Carmen. I think that we've been talking here about Christian maturity and trying to make the claim that the religious traditions and go together with many of the insights of modern psychology, and that they work together, and that we can set up a dialogue between religion and psychology. And there's certain elements in the psychological tradition, especially found among the more humanistic types, that really can help us to grow as individuals. And one of the things they say is that we need to learn to trust our intuitions. We have to be in touch with reality. And that fits in perfectly with the gospel of Jesus Christ, who invited all of us to really live life more fully.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Sister Carmen Gillick, a pastoral minister at St. Mary's Student Parish in Ann Arbor, Michigan. The topic of this week's Reflections was Christian maturity, trusting in our experience. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.